TROY-MYTHOS has no supply lines. TROY-MYTHOS is a new free expansion that's coming out for Total War Troy. Part of the TROY-MYTHOS expansion is the new historical mode, which I'm very interested in. There's also a new full-on mythological mode that's going to have actual magical beasts and magical spells and such like in the game. But probably the most exciting part of the announcement for me is the announcement that they're going to be removing supply lines from the game. Now, you may not be familiar with supply lines. It's not such a big deal if you play on lower difficulties, but on legendary difficulty in Total War Warhammer 2, which is the game that I mainly play, supply lines means that every additional army that you field on the campaign map after the first one gives you an extra 15% cost to your upkeep cost for every unit in all of your armies. So this can quickly become a crippling increase in cost for your armies. A lot of people have had a problem with supply lines, the way that it's implemented, because it essentially strongly incentivizes the players to have the minimum number of armies as possible. Later in the game, as you encounter more powerful enemy factions, more powerful armies, you're going to need more powerful armies as well. One option would be to have multiple armies of cheap, cost-effective troops and then overwhelm your enemies, surround them, those kind of tactics. But with the supply lines penalty, you're strongly de-incentivized to do that, because having a second, third or fourth army quickly becomes financially unsustainable. What you end up doing is condensing all your power into the smallest amount of armies possible, creating what's called doom stacks, which is a single army that has all of the most elite, most powerful units that you can possibly get in there. But if you only have one super powerful army, you don't have to pay that extra 15% for supply lines. Whereas if you have 2, 3, 4, that becomes plus 15%, plus 30, plus 45, plus 60% on all of your armies. It just becomes ridiculously expensive. So what's new in Total War TROY-MYTHOS? Mythos is introducing a new replacement for the supply line system called administration. This is not to be confused with the old corruption system that we used to have in Medieval 2, for example. The way that that used to work is basically the larger that your empire got in terms of territory, the more of a percentage that you would lose from your income because of corruption. The new administration system appears to work a little bit differently to that. Now, bear in mind, I don't have early access, so I haven't played with it myself, but from what I can tell, it appears that it still works like supply lines in that it increases the cost of your armies, but the increase in cost is based partly on how many armies you already have, partly on how many heroes you already have, and partly on how many territories you already have. So it's a little bit like the corruption mechanic in that it's partially based on territories, but it's still a little bit like supply lines because it's partially based on how many units you've got, apparently. And one other thing that they mentioned in the historical Total War announcement trailer, shout out to Havoc, who did a great Total War Troy video explaining the new administration mechanic. There's a link at the top to his entire video. Was that more elite units will be more costly in terms of their administration penalty. It appears that each unit has an administration cost value, which is normally 1 for basic units. Although I couldn't find any footage of any higher tier units administration costs, I assume that higher tier units would have an administration cost of 2 or maybe even 3 or 4. More elite units, more expensive units, will be penalized more by the supply lines penalty. And that's something that I've really been hoping for, looking for, because that kind of counteracts the whole doomstack system or strategy that you kind of currently forced to employ in Warhammer 2 when you're playing on legendary or higher difficulties. From the screens that we can see here, it seems as though all units have their food cost increased, whereas some units that require bronze will also have their bronze requirement increased, and some units that require gold will also have their gold cost increased. Obviously, they aren't going to be able to import this mechanic one-to-one straight into Warhammer 3 because Warhammer 3 is not going to have gold, bronze, or food. And also, Warhammer's different factions have very different economies. Some of them don't even have supply lines currently. However, it has been said that Creative Assembly uses these smaller saga titles as a sort of testing ground for mechanics that they might want to introduce into their bigger games. So I think it's highly likely that Creative Assembly will be looking at this mechanic as a possible improvement for the supply lines mechanic in Total War Warhammer 3. And even if they aren't currently, I think it's going to be a topic of conversation in the community. People are going to be watching to see how well this new administration mechanic performs, how satisfying and enjoyable it is in Total War TROY-MYTHOS, and we'll be wanting to know whether or not it's viable for Warhammer 3. If you know anything else about the new administration frustration mechanic that I haven't covered here, or you've got some opinions about whether you think it's going to solve the supply lines problem, please post in the comments below. I don't usually cover Total War Troy content. I'm primarily a Total War Warhammer content creator, so Troy fans might not find too much of interest on my channel, but if you're into Total War Warhammer 2 and the upcoming Warhammer 3, then by all means hit subscribe and the notification bell. Thanks guys, see ya.